Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, and today joining us from Basingstoke in the UK is Chris Stone. Hi Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
All right, so Chris is the Virtual Agile coach, a people first champion, and an Agile Evangelist, Agile Transformation Lead, and Scrum Master with over 8 years experience within the IT industry. So Chris, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
Right, so about myself, I'm afraid there's not really a spectacular tale or a witty adventure I can share about how I first became a Scrum Master or got into the Agile world. I basically began my career post-university with these aspirations at the time of being a project manager, because I knew that rigor and rules and things like that at the time, they made sense to me. I thought that equaled business success. So I basically joined this project management graduate scheme for a large consultancy, and I spent 3 or 4 months frustrated at being a kind of a PowerPoint and Excel lackey for one of the directors for a little bit. And I pushed for an opportunity to manage my first project, which I took on with aplomb. And a year later, I was managing multi-million-pound projects, and they involved multiple work streams, such as a new mobile front end for an Android application, refactoring the back end system to make it a bit less monolithic, and designing a future system to replace it all. And the mobile front end work stream was being delivered in Agile. Now, I had studied Agile at university, but I didn't actually have any hands-on experience with it. And I guess I was caught at the time between this command and control waterfall environment with all these tight commercials that were linked to financial control periods, and where my management were wanting Gantt charts and to understand schedule and things like that. Whilst I had this third party who were delivering the mobile front end, they were working in sprints and they had flexible scope. And I remember this immediate disconnect at the time when I had to ask the lead developer, Shebin, when are things going to be ready? I've got these delivery pressures. When is it going to be ready, Shebin? And I basically sat with him and we talked about their ways of working, and it brought me back to my studies, because I knew of Agile from my studies, but I'd never seen it in practice. I'd never seen it live and living and breathing, and it just made sense to me. Why wouldn't you want to check in frequently with your customers? Why wouldn't you want to seek feedback and iterate accordingly? Why wouldn't you work in that way rather than having this heavy commercial environment where you might have a requirement and then you only start testing it 6 months later? That seems nonsensical.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, as a project manager, one of the things that we learned very early on in our careers is that when the proverbial hits the fan, you have daily meetings to follow up on status, right?
Yeah.
So why not have that all the time?
Why not have all the time? It became, stand-ups. Absolutely. Now, obviously, the difference between that project management world and for me, what Agile tends to try and embody is that stand-ups aren't a status meeting, right? They're not about any one person standing there and saying, you tell me what you're doing. It's a meeting for the purpose of the team. It's for transparency. It's for the group that are working to understand their shared progress towards their goals, rather than it being for any one person to check on status. So for me, it just made sense, and I thought this was the way to get the right outcomes. So I was a convert, and I haven't looked back.
Very good.
And I was basically then headhunted by Accenture, another consultancy, and they'd seen I had some Agile experience, and they basically sold me as a Scrum Master to other clients, and I've been developing and understanding my Agile experience and experimenting ever since. So that's how I became a Scrum Master.
Absolutely. And very often project managers end up in that role because, as project managers, you're typically doing a lot of the things Scrum Masters do, like, getting people to talk to each other, organizing, and this is the key, collaboration meetings rather than just planning and status follow-up meetings. Project managers do this all the time. It's just that Scrum Masters have that as their main, set of tools, right? Setting up conversations, collaboration opportunities between the people that need to solve whatever the problems are that need to be solved. But Chris, of course, as we start that journey, there's ups and downs. There are things that go exactly as we expect, and there's also those surprises. So we want to explore one of those, perhaps not so agreeable surprise. We talk about failure on Monday because we want to learn from those stories. So share one of those stories with us, Chris.
Okay, so firstly, I love this topic. It's one I actually post about frequently on my own LinkedIn and my website, and I produce videos on the topic on my YouTube channel. I love the topic of failure, and in my experience, people don't like the word failure, and they don't like to talk about it. It's dirty. It's a negative rather than being perceived as an opportunity to learn. And I think this especially rings true for me with certain demographics and levels of hierarchy within companies. Now, often leadership, perhaps who have or are of a certain age, are disinclined to think of failure as a learning opportunity. They don't want to be seen as failing themselves and nor their companies. So for me, I firmly believe that failure needs to be destigmatized. And it's actually why I've personally embraced a bit of a motto: learn fast, learn often. And for me, that very slight tweak in language, Vasco, is better received by particularly those demographics and other groups of people. So, successful companies for me, they fail. They fail often, they fail fast, and they learn from their failures. I consider myself to be the product of failures. A series of mistakes, omissions, oversights, errors, defeats, frustrations, all things that I've learned from and continue to learn from each and every day. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so learning is, of course, the reason why we talk about this perhaps not so happy moments. But dive into one of those stories, Chris. Tell us the story. Walk us through the events as they were happening. Then we'll dive later on to the learnings. But walk us through that story.
Sure. So a really great example of failure I love to talk about was I was working for. This is back in my Accenture days, and I was working for a client that were doing a scaled Agile implementation. We had 8 squads working in parallel. We had very tight commercials that were heavily influenced by the number of bugs and how quickly those bugs and defects were resolved. And the timescales were tight. So it was still a bit of a hybrid waterfall Agile implementation, particularly on the commercial side. And one day, about midway through the day, we're up against it. We're supposed to be getting things out and ready very soon, and suddenly the database goes down, and no one knows why. And it was chaos. It was panic. People were, what's going on? How has this happened? There was kind of war rooms set up for root cause analysis and things like that, and no one could figure it out. Now the response that we got maybe 3 hours later was an email, a simple email from the person who had caused the failure, caused the database to go down. And they owned up to it, they admitted to their mistake, and they apologized. Now, what I think is beautiful about this story is that person wasn't punished. They weren't used as an example of what not to do. They were heralded. They were shared and discussed in a positive way. They were told that what they did was the right thing to do. They owned up to it. They made a mistake, and mistakes are okay. We are human. To err is human. To forgive, divine. So for me, if we can just as coaches, as Scrum Masters, do anything we can to engender that sort of spirit that failure is okay, then I think we're on the right track. And actually, what really surprises me about the topic of failure is that even my fellow Agile practitioners are often reluctant to talk about their own failures. I've tried, doing the concept of a failure swap shop where you kind of share war stories with one another for the purposes of learning. And even coaches and Scrum Masters who are out there day in, day out, encouraging their own teams to do retrospectives and examine their behavior, are often unwilling or reluctant to be vulnerable themselves and turn that mirror inwardly and examine their own failings.
So, Chris, I wanted to explore a little bit that story that you told, and also try to understand, from a Scrum Master perspective, what do you think was in place that allowed that person to first come forward, so not feel threatened by it, and then also the rest of the organization to accept it and instead of criticize and blame, to learn and move on? So what were the conditions in place so that we as Scrum Masters may, try to contribute to putting those conditions in place?
Sure. So a big popular topic at the moment is this concept, psychological safety. It's the ability for individuals, members of your team, members of your organization, to feel safe, to be vulnerable, to admit that they've made mistakes, to feel that they can contribute and their voice will be heard. And I feel that the environment that was provided by the leadership team and everyone else around enabled that person to have that psychological safety enough that they could admit that they made a mistake and they weren't going to be judged or punished as a consequence. For me, that was an absolutely huge thing. I think the second thing that I think was in place that contributed towards that environment was a clear sense of vision and clarity. So everyone had a shared understanding as to, we were in a bad situation. We were in a rough commercial environment. It wasn't fun. No one wanted to be there. Everyone wanted it to be better. And that shared clarity, that shared understanding, that shared sense of vision that we were all in it together, I think enabled that person to feel comfortable with opening up, because they made a mistake, but they were in it as part of the group and they wanted others to know, I'm sorry, it was my fault, but I've owned up to it and I will do whatever I can to try and fix the situation.
Which is the first step to actually fixing the problem, right? It's
Absolutely.
admitting there is a problem and, taking the step to, okay, so I accept, I failed, now I have to learn from it. Well, one thing that you mentioned that I think it's worthwhile exploring, especially for us as Scrum Masters, is this concept of having a vision, a shared understanding of the direction, perhaps a shared future in the organization. How do you think that organization was able to create that shared future for the teams?
I think they basically, the vision was transparent. So the leadership team, they conveyed very clearly what we were working towards in the next few months, what our goals, what our objectives were. They regularly iterated upon that through town hall meetings. So not only was it, right, in the next 3 months we're working on this, a month later, here is what we've achieved, here is what we've learned, and here is what we're working on next. And here is the next challenge we face. Here are the next experiments we're going to try and get us there. So I think it was being very transparent about that vision, what the vision was. It was enabling, as part of these town hall sessions, a kind of a bit of a Q&A to enable people to have their voice and share, I'm not quite getting this. How can you help me understand this better? And that, again, that environment, the ability to allow people a voice to share their concerns and make sure their understanding is there, along with the frequent reiteration of that vision through at least monthly town halls, I found, from my perspective, is what contributed towards everyone having that shared vision and being and understanding it.
Absolutely. And something to keep in mind and perhaps to help foster in our own work environment. Thank you very much for that, Chris.
Yeah.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests helped their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.